100 years later, they preserved these manuscripts, and every now and again, when one of them fell, if they started to fall into disrepair, they would copy them. So the Christian bards in the monasteries in Wales, they preserved the writings of the Druids. Although they'd become Christians, because they considered it the religion of their forefathers, they still had respect. And so it became a little bit mixed up with Christianity. And actually they had a sort of disciplic succession, because I've actually seen a list which goes back to the 1300s. A disciplic succession of bards who passed their information down just from master to disciple. So this was going on. But many of them actually forgot the meaning of it. But they did preserve these manuscripts, and they did continue to copy them when they fell into disrepair. They were kept on vellum manuscripts in the monasteries. But what happened is that during the reign of Henry VIII, many of the monasteries were dissolved. Henry VIII had many of these monasteries destroyed because actually they were found to be very corrupt. This is the story. And Henry VIII had his soldiers go to the monasteries. When you see a lot of the abbeys in England in ruins, like Glastonbury, for example. Glastonbury Abbey is just a ruin. It was actually destroyed by Henry VIII's men, who just came there, demolished the building, put the priests to death, the monks rather, and the head monk, they took him to the Tor, at the top of Glastonbury Tor, and hung him. So, this was going on around the country, and it was happening in Wales. So, at that time, these manuscripts, which were being held by the monks, they went into private ownership. They went into the stately homes of Wales, so the wealthy landowners. They went into their libraries. And at the time of Henry VIII, actually, around the same time, there was a bard who lived in Cardiff. He worked in the magistrates' court, actually, in Cardiff, but he was going to Raglan Castle on a regular basis and copying these manuscripts down. They would be kept in the library of the Earl of Pembroke at Raglan Castle. And so he was a regular visitor, and he was writing these, doing copies of the manuscripts. So at that time, they were being preserved in Wales, still, but in private hands. But it got to the point where no one really understood them anymore. The bardic tradition was still going on. Llewellyn Shawn, at the time of Henry VIII, was a bard, and he passed his information down to his disciples, and there was a bit of a disciplic succession, but it had largely been forgotten. So what happened then is, in the 18th century, there were several waves of Methodist campaigns in Wales, converting the Welsh people to Methodism. And the Methodist preachers would travel around Wales telling people to destroy these manuscripts. That these manuscripts, which talk about the ancient religion of Wales, was just the work of the devil, because the only true religion was Christianity. So if anyone knew of any of these manuscripts, they should destroy them. And at that time, many of these bardic manuscripts were destroyed, to the point where they were starting to become very, very scarce. So, in the 19th century, a Welsh manuscript society was formed for preserving these manuscripts which tell of the ancient religion of the British people. And it had lots of very, very big patrons. Queen Victoria was a patron of the Welsh Manuscript Society. So was the Tsar of Russia. And so was Napoleon III. Many, many big people around Europe were actually sponsoring the Welsh Manuscript Society in order to keep these documents alive, in order to keep them preserved for future generations. So, there was one bard who lived in the 18th century. His name has been thoroughly blackened by the Christian scholars of his day. But his bardic name was Ailo Morgannwg. And he lived actually just about 5 miles from the town that I grew up in. And he died in 1824. And he lived in a very small village called Flemingstone, just outside Barry. The village only has about half a dozen houses. And he had a bungalow there. And after his death, when they entered his bungalow, they found that his bungalow was full from floor to ceiling with Welsh manuscripts and copies of manuscripts. And these were actually bequeathed by his son to the National Library of Wales. And I read a report that one of the academics at Aberystwyth University had written, and he said, the shelves at Aberystwyth University groan under the weight of these manuscripts, which came from Ailo Morgannwg, which tell of the ancient traditions of the bards. They're very difficult to get access to. I've been there a couple of times. It's very difficult to get access to them. So, as I say, I got off the subject of 150 parallels. But almost everything about the culture of Britain, when we think of ancient Britain, as I say, we think of it as being a fairly barbaric place. And actually the story we've been told by the Romans is that they brought civilization to this country. Actually the opposite is true. They came here and destroyed the civilization. So, what I discovered is that the ancient culture of Britain, before the Romans arrived, was more or less identical with the ancient culture of India. There is almost no difference to be found. If we take the priests, the bards themselves, their appearance, they had shaved heads and seekers. Now we know this because when they became Christians, all of the bards, they gradually became Christians in the 6th century. The first thing the Christian monks made them do was shave off their tonsure, as they call it. In the English word, the seeker is called the tonsure. And it's described as a lock of hair that hung down from the crown of their head. And so, when they converted to Christianity, the Christians called it the devil's lock. So the first thing they made them do was shave off the devil's lock. But the Christians themselves, they wanted to be respected in the same way as the bards and druids were respected. So they had a tonsure themselves, but the opposite way round. So what they did is they shaved their head in the place where the druids grew their head. And that's why you see the monks, the Christian monks, they shave this little bit on top and they keep their hair around the rest of their head, because they just did it the opposite way round. So the Druids of Britain, they had exactly the same appearance. They had shaved heads and seekers. They wore cotton robes. They sat cross-legged in the temples. They had the custom of walking bare feet in the temples, in the sacred enclosure. They would take their shoes off. As I say, they performed fire sacrifice. But they also divided their society into the same 4 social and 4 spiritual orders. Now, this means that British culture was based on a Varnashrama system. Historians miss this point because they don't really have an understanding of Vedic culture. Caesar, for example, he mentions that there were only 2 classes. There were the priests and the warriors. But of course, there has to be a mercantile class. Otherwise, who's growing the food? Who's selling it? And of course, there always has to be a labouring class. So that gives you 4 classes. There's the priest, there's the warrior, there's the farmer, and there's the labouring class. So, in the Bardic writings, it describes also the different spiritual orders. Now, their system was that a young boy, usually, if he was trained to be a priest, he would leave his parents at the age of 4 or 5, and he would go and live with the master, with his teacher, guru. So he would leave his family and he would go and live with the guru, either in a hermitage in the forest or in a cave or in some place, usually in a peaceful, secluded place. And he would stay with his master up until the age of 25. Exactly matches the Varnashrama system of Gurukul, Brahmachari. And then, okay, so we've got Brahmachari life. We're understanding there also, not only that are they leaving the parents by the age of 5 and living with the master to 25, they're memorizing 20,000 sacred verses by heart. They're also learning all the mystical incantations. And actually this was part of the training of a Brahmin in ancient times. The Samaveda gives all the mystical mantras, so all of that was included. These druids, they had the power of chanting mystical incantations. They had mystical powers. This has been described. They could even control the weather. Okay, I'm going to go off the point a bit again, but for example, when St. Patrick went to Ireland, the king of Tara, he called his druids out, and they were matching their powers against that of St. Patrick. And so St. Patrick would chant a mantra and cause something to occur. And so the druids of the king of Tara would chant their mantras. And one druid came forward, he chanted a mantra, and in the middle of the afternoon he turned the whole sky black, as if it was night. And another druid came forward, and he chanted a mantra, and he caused it to snow, so that within a moment everyone was standing deep in snow. So these young bards, they learned all these mystical incantations. And actually this was very important, because they had the same system in Britain as in India, because the kings would not act independent of the instruction of a Brahmin. And in this country, the kings would not act independently of the druids. But there's a reason for this, because they were afraid of the druids' power, because the druids, like the Brahmins, they had the power to chant mystical mantras. And so it kept this sort of balance. So, okay, we've got brahmacharya. We've also got household life, because these young boys at the age of 25, they would take up household life. So they became, they stayed in household life up until about the age of 50, maybe 55. They spent up to about 30 years, 25, 30 years in household life. They were known as bards. And their job was to teach. They had no other occupation. In fact, they were barred from doing any manual work. If they were found, there were two things which there were two things that they were barred from doing. One was engaging in manual work, the other was warfare. So I'll just end up quickly by saying that we have then, when they finished their household life, after 25 years, they entered the forest. All of the bards in Britain, they would then go and spend 25 or 30 years in the forest with their wives, in practicing austerities, living in hermitages in the forest. This is recorded. And then, when they came out of the forest, the wife would leave and go back with her family, and then the husband would take the final stage, which is druid, the most senior of all of the stages. And in that stage he would be given a staff, the druid staff, which is the equivalent to the danda. So we see all of the four orders. And actually, in one of the Irish books that I read, the staffs that the druid had were made with 3 pieces of stick, which were bound with the cloth of the druid. So we find exactly the same Varnashrama, exactly the same traditions. So thank you very much, and perhaps I'll have a chance to come and speak some other time.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Your story is fascinating. Also, the material that you're presenting, it's not just fascinating, but has a lot of value for our preaching.
Yes.
It's a preaching thing.
Yes.
Are you in touch with the Florida Vedic College?
Nemai Maharaj has asked me to get in touch and to get involved. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I may do. Yes, certainly.
Because we are looking through the Vedic College for people like you,
yes,
to present the material to them. Then they can publish it, and also they award degrees like PhD, and your stuff is strong enough to actually do that like this.
Yes.
So if you can team up with Mahabodhi,
yeah,
it'd be great.
He's asked me to get in touch with Mahabodhi, who I think is in Chippenham at the moment. Is that right? Yes. Yeah. So I will be doing that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very much.